Concluded. Questions without notice. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last night in the Parliament, the member for Fadden said the government should make it cheaper to rent $100 million super yachts by cutting the GST. Is the reason the Prime Minister has refused to support Labor's policy to axe the GST on tampons because he, just like the member for Fadden, would prefer to abolish the GST on super yachts? Is this Prime Minister and this government so out of touch that they consider tampons a luxury and super yachts a necessity?
The Treasurer.
I thank the Prime Minister. Once again, the member for Sydney has demonstrated she doesn't know how to tell the truth. She does not know how to tell the truth, Mr Speaker. These are the simple facts. GST is applied to those vessels if you buy them, if you lease them. It's a 10%, Mr Speaker. They're the facts. Stop telling untruths.
The member for Swan. Member for Swan.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is delivering on its commitments, growing the economy and guaranteeing essential services, including in my electorate of Swan?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, the government is delivering on its promises and building a stronger economy for all Australians, which enables us to guarantee the essential services Australians depend on. And we are ensuring that the survivors, the victims of child sexual abuse, receive the support they need and deserve in the wake of these horrific events perpetrated over many decades. Now, the Royal Commission not only heard, recorded and respected the testimony of shocking sexual abuse suffered by children across the nation, it enabled the survivors to be heard and, most importantly, to be believed. Many of them heard and believed for the first time in their lives. This week, as a nation, we've taken several important steps in the journey of healing. All states and territories now, with the exception of Western Australia, have signed up to the National Redress Scheme. We now have 5 major non-government institutions who have opted in: the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Salvation Army, the Scouts and the YMCA. Now, that means that roughly 48,000 people, it's about 80% of the 60,000 survivors, should now be covered by the National Redress Scheme. The House has passed the National Redress Bill, and it's now up to the Senate to pass the bill to ensure that we can begin delivering this redress to survivors from the 1st of July. And just this week, Mr Speaker, the Attorney-General's announced the government will undertake the most significant review of Australians' intelligence laws in 40 years. The first priority of our government is keeping Australians safe, securing our nation's borders and frustrating and preventing the ever-present terrorist threat. It's why we've ensured our law enforcement and intelligence agencies have the resources and the powers they need to keep us and every Australian safe, and that includes properly funding and supporting the Australian Border Force with policies that discourage the people smugglers and the criminals who, when Labor was in government, had the immigration policy of Australia outsourced to them. We have a strong economy and we have the resources, but above all the character and the determination to do justice to Australians who have been wronged and to keep Australians safe and our borders secure.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to reports the Health Minister unleashed a torrent of expletives and physically intimidated a 71-year-old grandmother. Why did the Prime Minister and his office ignore this behaviour for over 6 months? Given the high standards expected of ministers under his ministerial standards, is the Prime Minister so arrogant and so out of touch that he chose to ignore this shocking behaviour until it was raised by the media?
The member for Member for Barker and the member for North Sydney will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
The Treasurer.
Well, I
Minister
thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question. My office did not ignore the correspondence from the Mayor of Katherine. Quite the contrary. The minister has apologised, and as was appropriate,
Members on my left.
and he's apologised, and that was what the Mayor of Katherine sought from him, and that apology was appropriate.
The member for Goldstein.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the government's plan to reduce taxes will grow the economy and create more jobs for Australians? And is the Treasurer aware of any other proposals?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Goldstein for his question. He knows that our budget is a plan for a stronger economy, and under the coalition government, under the Liberal and National parties, that's what we've got, a stronger economy. A stronger economy where there are more than 1 million jobs that have been created since we were first elected in 2013, some 415,000 in the record year of jobs, at more than 1,000 jobs every single day on average. Now, a key component of our plan for a stronger economy is to ensure that we keep taxes under control, that we make sure that taxes do not choke growth, take away jobs from the economy, prevent wage increases and stymie investment. And we have a clear plan to keep taxes under control and a clear control on those taxes in our fiscal strategy. But on top of that, Mr Speaker, we have delivered into this place two important tax plans. The first one, the personal tax plan, that provides $140 billion worth of tax relief to all working Australians, which the Labor Party came in here and tried to chop in half, Mr Speaker. That's our personal tax plan, dealing with bracket creep, ensuring that 94% of Australians don't pay more than 32.5 cents in the dollar. We have a personal tax plan that works for all Australians, Mr Speaker, and it's why we have had an enterprise tax plan that ensures that we can keep our businesses competitive, to ensure that they have competitive tax rates, because we do not think Australian businesses should pay the highest corporate tax rates in the world. We know that if businesses are forced to pay the government more tax, then they are not in a position to invest in their businesses, to invest in their employees, to grow their businesses, to access new markets, to do all of those things. The Labor Party thinks the best thing business can do is give money to the government. We think the best thing business can do is create jobs, Mr Speaker, and that's why our competitive tax plan is there to create jobs. But it's also what we're not doing. And I'll tell you what we're not doing. We're not going to put a $220 billion tax burden, and yes, it is a burden, the member for Batman, a tax burden on the Australian economy with their ramping up of taxes into the stratosphere. And let's not forget, which is the biggest tax that they will put on the Australian economy in their first budget if they were to become a government, on retirees. 3,500 of them in Braddon, 7,600 of them in Mayo, 4,300 of them in Longman, all would be hit by Labor's retiree tax, which goes to rip off the tax refunds from Australians who have committed the great sin of investing in an Australian company, Mr Speaker. And they want to rip those tax refunds away for no other reason that they cannot control their appetite for tax, because they cannot control their spending when they're in government.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. It's reported the Prime Minister's office dismissed the Health Minister's reported torrent of expletives and physical intimidation of a 71-year-old grandmother as a private matter. Is this Prime Minister really so arrogant that he's willing to dismiss his minister's reported torrent of expletives and physical intimidation of a grandmother as a purely private matter? How could it possibly be private when he met a mayor about a community health matter on a sitting day in Canberra?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, the member for Goldstein is warned, as he was yesterday, as is the member for Latrobe. I only just managed to hear that question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The report the honourable member refers to is untrue. The Minister for Health, however, wishes to completely answer the question.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to make two statements. Firstly, in December I did meet with a delegation from Katherine. I believe there were 3 members in that delegation, and there were 2 members of my office, including myself. During the course of the conversation I used strong language. I have apologised to the Mayor of Katherine, and today I want to repeat that apology publicly and sincerely and absolutely. It was my fault and my responsibility, and I accept that. I think it's important for me to both repeat that, and I have apologised to the Mayor, and to repeat that apology publicly. And my fault, my responsibility. The matter was raised, I believe, at the time that the Prime Minister's office received material by his staff. They acted immediately. I took too long. My fault, my responsibility.
The member for Indi.
Thank you.
Member for Indi will just pause for a second. If members on my left could cease interjecting, the member for Indi could ask her question and I'd be able to hear it. The member for Indi.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister about regional education. Prime Minister, in my electorate of Indi, 6.2% of residents have tertiary qualifications, against a state average of 17.8%. And this week the government agreed to all of the recommendations in the independent review into regional, rural and remote education by Professor Halsey. The review called for the establishment of a national regional education strategy and task force to deliver these recommendations. Prime Minister, will you commit to establishing the task force, developing a national regional education strategy to improve the education outcomes of all regional Australians?
The Prime Minister has the
floor. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question and commend her for a strong commitment to supporting regional students, regional universities and regional economic growth. My government is committed to bridging the divide between education outcomes in the city and the bush. We recognise, as the member does, that thriving regional and rural communities are a key to Australia's success, and they need a high-performing education system, and that no matter where you go to school, you deserve the opportunity to pursue your passions and receive a quality education. And that's why we undertook the review that the honourable members referred to, led by Professor Halsey. Yesterday, the government released its response to the review, and that announcement showed our commitment to delivering better outcomes and more opportunities for regional, rural and remote students. It showed our commitment to taking a whole-of-government approach to this issue, with the Deputy Prime Minister and the ministers responsible for education, regional communications, regional development, local government and social services joining together for the announcement. The government's accepted all 11 recommendations of the review. In doing so, we're putting the education needs of the almost 400,000 students from regional, rural and remote communities front and centre. Recommendation 11 is one that will be of particular interest to the member for Indi. It's to establish a national focus for regional, rural and remote education to enhance access, outcomes and opportunities in regions. The government acknowledges that a one-size-fits-all approach to regional policy does not work, and I know the honourable member agrees with that. So we're investing in partnerships with communities to ensure that national policies are informed by local people living in the regions. Now, the government will undertake an annual assessment of the adequacy of the support universities offer students in regional, rural and remote areas on transitioning to higher education, including student accommodation, a key issue, and that information will be included on the National Admissions Information Platform. In the recent budget, we provided $28.2 million to expand accessibility to sub-bachelor programs in regional areas and $14 million to expand accessibility for bachelor students at regional study hubs. We're creating 500 new commencing sub-bachelor places at Australian universities and additional 500 Commonwealth-supported bachelor places for students.
The Prime Minister will just resume his seat for a second. The member for Indi on a point of order.
Yeah, just a point of order. A question of relevance. I actually asked about a national strategy.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been outlining what the government's strategy is, and I can if the honourable member, I'll just complete briefly. In the short time left, Mr. Speaker, this is a matter of enormous interest to the government and to the honourable member. There's a lot more to be said and a lot more work to be done, and I look forward to working with her on it.
The member for Petrie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please update the House on recent assessments of the Australian economy, and how does the government's plan support a stronger economy over the next decade, and how does this compare to previous plans?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank again the member for Petrie for his question on the budget. And as our budget is a plan for a stronger economy, and I'm pleased that the budget has been so well received, Mr. Speaker, as a credible plan. So much so that the opposition has given up asking questions about it, Mr. Speaker. They put up the white flag on the budget some weeks ago.
The member for Bird is now warned.
Mr. Speaker, our economy is stronger under the Liberal and National parties. As I just said, more than 1 million jobs have been created since we came to government. In our record year of job growth, more than 1,000 jobs created every day, and 75% of those being full-time jobs. And we've seen today in the non-mining capex figures up 8.4% for the year. But importantly, another positive quarter of growth in non-mining capital expenditure, and that is the first time we've seen 6 quarters of consecutive growth in more than 20 years, Mr. Speaker. We have a plan for a stronger economy, and that is driving investment in this economy, which is driving jobs, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I think Australians are confident in the economic plans of the Liberal and National parties under the Turnbull government, Mr. Speaker, because they are seeing those results. But there is more to come, and there is more work to be done, because we want to ensure that those economic benefits stretch right across the whole economy, and that's why we must stick to that plan. Today, the OECD has released a report which confirms the strength of the Australian economy, and it endorses the forecast that was set out in the budget, referring specifically to the economy growing at a, and I quote, a robust pace. It refers to rising household incomes, falling unemployment, and points to, and I quote, wage growth picking up. And it also makes reference to the fact that public debt will be falling, and it finds that a strong economy, expenditure control and revenue integrity measures are helping to deliver the commitment for deficit reduction. Now, that is a pretty strong endorsement from the OECD about the strong economic management of the Turnbull government and the strong performance of the Australian economy. But it wasn't always that way, because when we came to government, we had to deal with the economic and fiscal catastrophe that was left to us by those who sit on that side of the House now. And for the sake of the Australian economy, they need to stay on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker, because when we came to government, we had to wrestle debt growth running at 30%. 30%. There was a gorilla of debt running under them, Mr. Speaker, and we had to wrestle that gorilla to the ground, which is what we've done, Mr. Speaker, because under this budget, debt falls by $30 billion over the next 4 years, and it falls by $230 billion over the next 10 years, Mr. Speaker. This government has turned that around. We've ensured that we've put Australia on a firm fiscal footing, confirmed by the OECD today, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party cannot live within their means. That's why they cannot be trusted to achieve these outcomes for the Australian economy, which have been reckoned.
The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer. Is the Prime Minister or his office aware of any other incidents or complaints involving the Health Minister's language or behaviour towards stakeholders, public servants or staff?
We are aware of other allegations.
Members on my right. The member for McKellar. Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question. All ministers are expected to treat the people with whom they deal, whether they are third parties, stakeholders, constituents, colleagues, public servants, with respect. And sometimes ministers fall short. The Minister for Health has acknowledged that he did fall short, and he has apologised for it, as he should.
The member for The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Ballarat will resume her seat, and the member for Boothby has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the government's 10-year infrastructure investment pipeline is connecting local communities and creating local jobs in South Australia? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any risks to this plan?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Good to get a question about the economy. Good to get a question from the member for Boothby. She's a true local fighter, a voice for the people. You need to look no further than the member for Boothby when it comes to a good local champion, a good fighter for her local community and for the economy. And like all members on this side of the chamber, she's passionate about delivering the infrastructure, the jobs for her local community, for South Australia, for the nation. Our $75 billion job-creating, economy-building, 10-year investment pipeline of infrastructure will continue to strengthen our economy by connecting local communities, increasing local productivity and creating local jobs. Jobs, jobs and more jobs. We've helped small and medium enterprises create 1 million jobs, 1 million jobs in 5 years, 5 months, less than 5 years in fact. We are delivering, adding to the more than 1 million jobs we've created. It's all about a strong economic blueprint. Our plan is to take the pressure off household bills, off tax liabilities for workers, for small and medium family enterprises, and not to rip pensioners off, putting downward pressure on the cost of living, making it easier to grow, invest and create more jobs, and making sure that the right infrastructure is in place. And in South Australia, the Liberal and Nationals federal government is delivering up to $1.39 billion for the North-South corridor, adding to the $1.6 billion already invested in the project. And I tell you who's delighted about it, not just the member for Boothby, but the Premier of South Australia, good man, Stephen Marshall. Had a meeting with him last night. He's delighted. He's delighted by the investment we're making in South Australia. Electrifying the Gawler rail line to cater for the increased passenger numbers, duplicating the Joy-Belush AM Bridge in the member for Grey's electorate. There's so much more. We're rolling out $95 million for the Oaklands Crossing, more than $42 million for the Flinders Link and more than $1.55 million for local community infrastructure projects in the member for Boothby's electorate. $18.5 million for the Lobethal Freight Access and South Eastern Freeway upgrades in Mayo, where we've also seen a new bridge for Blewett Springs Road, $3.75 million for the Mount Barker Regional Football Centre, $500,000 for the Victor Harbour community facility, and more than $471,000 for local community infrastructure projects to date through the Building Better Regions Fund. We're getting on with building a better South Australia, a better future. But I'm asked about the risks. And they're looking at me opposite. They are looking at me opposite. They're doing a bit of yelling, but they are a risk. They are a risk to jobs. They are a risk for higher taxes, for lower wages. That's what they are. They're all sitting there opposite, beholden to the union movement and beholden to a lesser economy.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answers. And I again ask, is the Prime Minister or his office aware of any other incidents or complaints involving the Health Minister's language or behaviour towards stakeholders, public servants or staff? Yes or no?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister is doing an outstanding job. The Minister is overseeing record levels of funding and support in every field of health. The Minister is rectifying the failings of the Labor Party in government. The Minister is listing one life-saving drug after another on the PBS in a manner that the Labor Party was not able to afford to do. The Minister's management of the health portfolio is saving lives.
Members on both sides, the member for Ballarat on a point of order.
Point of order is direct relevance.
Pretty straightforward.
Has the Prime Minister's concluded his answer? The member for Cowper has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Could the Minister update the House on the importance of strong border protection policies? Are there risks, Minister, with alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs, the member for Grindler will cease interjecting.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. The government certainly, Mr Speaker, sees as a top priority the effort to keep our borders secure, because if we keep our borders secure, we can keep our country safe. And, Mr Speaker, the government inherited an enormous mess when it came to border protection. The fact is that some 50,000 people came on 800 boats. Tragically, 1,200 people drowned at sea. And, Mr Speaker, we were able to implement Operation Sovereign Borders, a number of changes, and we have seen a stop to those boats, even though the people smugglers are still there, probably waiting for a Labor government at some point into the future, and they would believe, rightly, that they'd be back in business. Now, Mr Speaker, there was a debate last weekend in Victoria, and there was a proposal, given the civil war that's taking place on border protection within the Labor Party at the moment, for their policy to be debated at the conference in Victoria. But, Mr Speaker, as we now know, the debate never proceeded because the CFMEU moved its block of votes in support of the Leader of the Opposition to close the debate down. So riven with division is the opposition. They don't even want to air the for and against on border protection policy. Now, Mr Speaker, why is this unholy alliance continuing between the CFMEU and the Leader of the Opposition? Well, Mr Speaker, there is a long and sordid history when it comes to the CFMEU and the Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition is personal friends with many within the CFMEU, and the fact is, Mr Speaker, that millions and millions of dollars have been donated by the CFMEU to the Labor Party, and we know now that over 70 CFMEU officials have been charged with offences, and it is the most lawless union in the country, Mr Speaker. Now, I noted again that this Leader of the Opposition refuses to rule out taking money from the CFMEU, whereas Bob Hawke disassociated himself with those unions that had gone rogue. This Leader of the Opposition clearly does not have the character. Now, Mr Speaker, I noticed in the Courier Mail this week that a CFMEU official, Mr Dave Hanna, has been charged with rape, Mr Speaker. The Minister will resume his seat.
Well, the Minister will resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Lindsay is warned. Just at this point, I'm just asking the Minister to resume his seat because I just want to make it very clear to the House I'm concerned that we're about to get into territory that is sub judice. Now, I'm going to address the matter without the Minister giving a running commentary. Otherwise, I'll solve the problem in another way, frankly. I'm entitled to address the House on what I consider to be an important matter. The Minister may well find that if he's looked at practice, there are general principles with respect to the sub judice rule. And one of those key principles is that, and I'll quote, "As a general rule, matters before courts should not be referred to from the time the person is charged until a sentence, if any, has been announced, and the restriction should apply again if an appeal is lodged and remain until the appeal is decided." Now, what the Minister has done so far is on the right side of the line. He's merely referring to a public fact. But I've taken the decision to sit him down to warn in advance that matters that could be sub judice need to be avoided, and I'm making that clear in advance. And I also, that's a very good point, and the Minister knows the rules on props.
Mr Speaker, to your point, I had no intention to go beyond that. Okay. It's a publicly reported matter. I don't go to any other matters in relation to
I just say to the Minister, he doesn't need to have a commentary on it. But I wanted to give you that assurance, Mr. Speaker.
But, Mr Speaker, The point that I go to is the fact that the CFMEU is the most lawless union in the country, and yet they are best mates with this Leader of the Opposition. People of questionable character who donate millions of dollars to the Labor Party, and this Leader of the Opposition doesn't have the strength of character to stand up to people of this ilk.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning, One Nation Senator Brian Burston confirmed that the Prime Minister did a secret deal with Senator Pauline Hanson's One Nation party on his $80 billion corporate tax cut, and I quote, "After the hour meeting, we shook hands with Matthias Cormann. We agreed to the deal signed off by the Prime Minister." Why won't this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister share the details of that deal with the Australian people?
The Prime Minister has
Well,
the call.
Mr Speaker, we're committed to doing everything we can to secure the votes of the senators to pass our budget measures. We are determined. We're determined to deliver on our commitment to the Australian people to deliver jobs and growth. We've come a long way. Record jobs growth last year, 415,000 jobs. And we're managing the budget in a way that is bringing it back into balance a year early. We're guaranteeing the essential services that Australians depend on, including health services, as I mentioned in my earlier answer, record funding for schools, and our reform of personal income tax is going to see the biggest comprehensive reform of personal income tax in more than a generation. These are big reforms, and they are driving investment, productivity, more jobs and better jobs. And the Labor Party should be supporting it. And they should be supporting our cuts to company tax for all the reasons so eloquently put by the Leader of the Opposition when he was taking a previous position. He's had so many on this issue. He said, we all know, he said every student of economic history knows. He said that. He said knows that lower company tax results in more investment, higher productivity, more jobs and higher wages. So the Labor Party, it's not too late to return to the rationality of years past and back Australian jobs. That's what we're doing. We're backing jobs, we're backing investment, we're backing enterprise. It's about time the Labor Party did too.
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is safeguarding the retirement savings of all Australians, including those in my electorate of Leichhardt? Is the Minister aware of any different ideas that would put these retirement savings at risk?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question and for his very strong and passionate advocacy on behalf of his constituents, and particularly he is very, very concerned about their savings and in particular their retirement savings. I want to assure him that the government is doing everything within our power to protect those retirement savings. We know that superannuation savings are the second biggest asset for most Australians. Unfortunately, though, for those Australians who are younger and on lower incomes, they have been particularly dudded by the changes made by the Leader of the Opposition in uncapping fees and forcing them into high insurance premiums that they do not want, do not need and in many cases cannot even claim on. But the government is doing something about this. We are making sure that we are safeguarding people's savings and their nest eggs. We are going to reunite Australians with their hard-earned money, with their lost superannuation or their inactive superannuation accounts, and we are doing that proactively and automatically through the Australian Taxation Office. This will mean that nationally we will reunite people with around $6 billion of their own money. That is around about $1.3 billion that will go to the people in Queensland. That is something I know that the member for Leichhardt is very keen on, and also the candidate for Longman, Trevor Ruthenberg. I know that he is very, very passionate about protecting Australian retirement accounts. We are also banning
exit fees. We are making sure that there is no barrier for people to be able to go and find another account, one that might be better for them, which currently they are not able to do under the existing rules that prohibit those people who have got an enterprise bargaining agreement from choosing their own fund. Now, who is standing in the way of this? Well, I'm sad to say the Leader of the Opposition is standing in the way of this. The members opposite are standing in the way of this. And the question is really why? Why is it that they are doing this? Well, it might be because they have got another plan. Their plan is instead to propose even more regressive charges, fees and taxes on retirees. They have got a tax, a $55 billion tax on the pockets of hundreds of thousands of Australians, including those 165,000 Queenslanders. This opposition cannot be trusted in government. This shifty Leader of the Opposition cannot be trusted to protect the retirement savings of Australians. Do not give him the chance.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government's granted just 4 Medicare MRI licences in almost 5 years, meaning that access to MRIs covered by Medicare has become a lottery of location. Why won't this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister join Labor's $80 million commitment for 20 new Medicare MRI licences instead of making secret deals with Pauline Hanson to give an $80 billion handout to his friends in big business?
The Minister for Health. Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I am delighted to answer this question because in last year's budget
members on my left,
we made a $2 billion 10-year commitment to diagnostic imaging. Let me repeat that, a $2 billion 10-year commitment to diagnostic imaging. And that was about ensuring 2 critical things. One, that we would retain the bulk billing incentive for diagnostic imaging, a very important step which happened on our watch, in our time, where we made that decision as part of the first budget in health of which I was privileged to be a part. Secondly, and very significantly, we indicated that we would become the first government in almost 2 decades to index a series of diagnostic imaging items: mammography, fluoroscopy, CT, interventional. None, let me repeat, not one of those was indexed at any time under Labor's period in government. Not one, not mammography, not fluoroscopy, not CT, not interventional items, yet each of those will be indexed under us. So a $2 billion commitment. That is exactly what we've done. And actually, in relation to MRIs, only a couple of weeks ago, I visited Frankston Hospital with its new MRI licence with the Treasurer and the member for Dunkley. And so what you see there, you want to talk about pies?
Members on my left. Members on both sides.
We can talk pies if you want.
Members on both sides.
But what we say is that whether it's Frankston, whether it's $2 billion of MRI funding, whether it's record Medicare funding, across the diagnostic sector, we are doing things that Labor never did. And for that will make a real difference to funding in the sector, a real difference to the ability of Australians to seek diagnostic imaging. But remember one thing, despite 6 years in government, Labor did not touch mammography, fluoroscopy, CT or interventional, and we will be indexing all of them.
The member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on how the government policies are putting downward pressure on power prices and how this is leading to more affordable and reliable energy for Australian businesses and families? How does this compare to other plans?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member from McKellar for his
Members
question.
on my left.
And he knows there's a clear difference between the Labor Party and the Coalition on energy. The Labor Party wants to put your prices up, and the Coalition wants to drive them down, Mr Speaker. Under the Coalition, you will always pay less for your power bill than under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. And let's look at the Labor Party's record. When the Labor Party was last in office, power prices doubled, Mr Speaker. We got the dreaded $15 billion carbon tax. They ignored the warnings on gas. They didn't do anything to stop the gold plating of the networks, and they let the retail market get out of control, Mr Speaker. In contrast, the Coalition have a plan. And our plan, Mr Speaker, was to abolish the carbon tax, which saw the single biggest drop in electricity prices ever recorded, Mr Speaker, to stop the networks gaming the system, to get a better deal for thousands of Australian families from their retailers, to secure more gas before it's exported overseas, to build the infrastructure of the 21st century with Snowy 2.0, and to integrate energy and climate policy for the first time with the National Energy Guarantee, which will lower people's power bills. And the good news for families and businesses across Australia is that from the start of this year, wholesale power prices are down some 30% of what they were last year. Now, this is good news for the nearly 9,000 small businesses in Braddon, the nearly 12,000 small businesses in Longman, the 19,000 small businesses in Mayo, Mr Speaker, like Harvest Moon in Braddon, in Port, Mr Speaker, which exports around the world cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, no hot pies, Mr Speaker, but plenty of beans, plenty of beetroot and plenty of broccoli, Mr Speaker. They want to employ more forklift drivers, more field hands, Mr Speaker, more packers, and they can do that with lower power bills. Like John Cranwell in Mayo, Mr Speaker, who's a third-generation Brussels sprout grower in Nairn. Like Delta Hydraulics in Braddon in Devonport, with 110 people that it wants to continue to employ, Mr Speaker. Now, Labor cannot be trusted on energy. They cannot. They have reckless renewable targets, Mr Speaker. They want to bring back the electricity tax, Mr Speaker, and they want to push up your power bills, Mr Speaker. Only the Coalition can deliver a more affordable and reliable power system for Australian families and businesses.
The member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. This Prime Minister is forcing Australians to wait until they're 70 for the age pension. Does this arrogant and out-of-touch former investment banker of a Prime Minister seriously expect a nurse or a bricklayer to work until they're 70, at the same time that he's working with One Nation to give an $80 billion handout to big business?
The Prime Minister has the floor.
I thank the honourable member. I thank the honourable member for her question, and I imagine if there'd been more time allotted to the question, she could have run through my entire career and characterised it so favourably. Oh, she's leaping up. She's leaping up to do that. Oh, good on you. That's terrific. Thank you. Thank you. Well, look, Mr.
Member for
Speaker,
Jagga Jagga.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is this. The reality is this. We have a stronger economy. We have ensured we have that. It was in fact the honourable member for Jagga Jagga that at once almost echoed John Howard in saying that the best form of welfare is a job. The objective, of course, is to get people into employment. We not only have record jobs growth, that's a good. The honourable member's shaking her head. Surely you want to have more people in work. We have record jobs growth and, Mr. Speaker, the lowest percentage of Australians of working age on welfare in 25 years. Now, that's a matter to be celebrated. That's one of the reasons the budget is in better shape, and that's what a stronger economy gives you. And here we have the Labor Party that is only promising higher taxes, Higher taxes on business. What's that going to do? Less investment, fewer jobs, lower wages. Higher taxes on investment, on property. What's that going to do? Less investment. Again, fewer jobs, lower wages. And then, of course, most shameful of all, I don't know how the honourable member can live with that policy. I imagine she was shocked by it. Raiding the savings of retirees. How, really?
Members on my right. The member for Jagga.
The honourable members opposite. They always tell us how they are dripping with empathy. But what about people in their 80s who are going to lose 30% of their income?
Prime Minister will resume his
them?
seat. Members on my right. Members on my right. The member for Deacon's warned. The member for Jagga on a point of order.
On relevance,
member
what
for
about
Jagga will resume her seat. The member for Jagga will resume her seat. Just going to make 2 points. I asked the member for Jagga to resume her seat on a number of occasions, and I'm going to rule on that point of order. No way. Not with the amount of character assessment in that question and the breadth of policy. I don't know what you missed in it. It's a very— Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member and her leader can accuse me of being a friend of big business for as much as they like. No, they can't. But you know something? I've never sold out people I represent. I've never sold out workers. I've never sold out the people who work for their penalty rates, not like the Leader of the Opposition. And who did he sell them out for? He sold them out to big business. There has never been a better friend of big business, never been a bigger sycophant, a bigger sucker-up than the Leader of the Opposition. Big business in Melbourne know him for what he is.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. Members on both sides, members on my right. Members on both sides. The member for Wakefield. Member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Small and Family Business, the Workplace and Deregulation. Will the Minister update the House on how small businesses are responding to the government's enterprise tax plan? Did the practices of the past produce the same results, Minister?
The Minister for Small Business.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fisher for his question. And I do note, Mr Speaker, we have many barristers in this place. I would actually argue far too many. But I can say that I don't think we have another barrister that is also a builder, Mr Speaker. And I note that the member for Fisher and his background in the building industry, and I thank him for his question, his passion for small and family business. And there are some 3.3 million small and family businesses, as we speak, Mr Speaker, enjoying tax relief from our enterprise tax plan. 437,000 of those are in Queensland. A net increase of the number of businesses that have opened in the last financial year of Queensland, Mr Speaker, is 12,031 small and family businesses, more than there were last financial year. How does that compare to the last time the opposition were in power? A decrease in their last financial year of 14,178 small and family businesses, 10,000 of those 14,000 in Queensland alone. And in Longman, Mr Speaker, there are 12,201 SMEs enjoying tax relief from the enterprise tax plan. 532 new businesses have opened up in the last financial year in Longman alone. And as Longman voters Daniel Carter and Tegan Austin told The Australian last week, Mr Speaker, and I quote, "Running our own business, we find you can get to a certain mark before you get screwed over by the taxman." A direct quote. Mr Speaker, I'm asked what's the threat, and I mentioned yesterday the secret deal that the Leader of the Opposition has done with John Secker, his great mate, and the CFMEU. And I gave a helicopter view of John Secker's civil rights crusading 59 criminal offences. But I went inside. I thought it's interesting. It would be good to drill down and see the character of this civil rights activist, and I found a few of his threatening and intimidating charges. The quotes in them quite interesting. This is the guy that the Leader of the Opposition has done a secret deal with that we don't know what's in, and those that, if he's elected, will have it inflicted upon them Australia-wide. He said, and I quote, "You just watch, I'll get you. I've got a 12-year-old son, and I swear on his life. I swear on my son's life. You watch, I will fix you up." To another worker found guilty of saying, "I'll quit my job and get you." When asked if he was making a threat, Mr Secker replied, "I'm not threatening, Mr Speaker. I promise you I will get you." To a whole group of workers just trying to gain entry to a site, he said, "You will die. You're going to cop it. I'm going to kill your family." This is the quality of the bloke, John Secker, that the Leader of the Opposition has done a secret deal with, Mr Speaker. We don't know what's in it. His own front bench don't know what's in it. We will have it inflicted upon us if he is elected at the next election. We cannot, for the sake of those small businesses, whether it be in Longman or anywhere else, allow that to happen.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the government's new banking executive accountability legislation. What sanctions would the chairman of an investment bank such as Goldman Sachs be subject to under these new measures when he dishonestly breaches the Corporations Act in advising on the sale of an insurance company, when that sale then contributes to the greatest corporate collapse in Australian history?
Members on my left. Treasurer has the call.
I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to talk about the banking executive accountability regime, Mr Speaker. This is a very good example of how the Turnbull government has been taking action to deal with misconduct in the banking and financial system. It follows the work that was done following the financial systems inquiry that was initiated by the coalition government when we came to office, which I note the previous government refused to undertake. Right. They refused to undertake the financial systems inquiry. They refused to, frankly, do anything in relation to banking executive accountability when they were in offices, despite the fact they dealt with Opus Prime, despite the fact there was Storm Financial, despite the fact there was the takeover of CommBank, of Bankwest, despite the ANZ landmark transaction. When all of this was going on, Mr Speaker, where was the Leader of the Opposition then? Where was the Shadow Treasurer then, when they were in government? Well, I know what the Shadow Treasurer was doing. He was the Minister for Immigration, completely stuffing up our borders, Mr Speaker. But when it came to those who want to talk about these issues, they presided over all of these things and did absolutely nothing. As the member for Bradfield, the Minister reminded us yesterday, turned a 000 phone number into a policy when it came to what they did to deal with misconduct in the banking and financial system. What we have done is put in place the toughest set of accountability rules for banking executives that have ever existed in this country, Mr Speaker. It is changing the conduct and will change the conduct in our banking and financial system because of the penalties, because of the sanctions. What will happen under this regime is bankers who do the wrong thing will no longer be able to just slip out the side, Mr Speaker, and go and work in another bank somewhere else. They won't be able to work in a bank ever again, Mr Speaker. That is what our rules are doing. That's the action that we're taking. We've doubled the penalties for jail terms from 5 years to 10 years. That's what we're doing as a result of the enforcement task force that we put together to look at the penalties that came out of the review of the financial systems inquiry, and we're taking action with tougher penalties. On those penalties, they can face penalties up to $1 million, just under that, personally, and for individual institutions, some $200 million, Mr Speaker, in penalties as a result of the tough rules that we are putting in place. What the Labor Party did for the victims of misconduct in the banking and financial system was zip, zero and nothing, and they should be ashamed of their misconduct in overseeing that system.
The member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. Will the minister update the House on how the government is increasing support to older Australians, especially those living in regional, rural and remote Australia, including in my electorate of Page, and how do different courses of action threaten the well-being of older Australians?
The Minister for Aged Care.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Page for his question, for his continued and ongoing interest in looking after older Australians in regional, rural and remote Australia, and his contribution to the budget. Every year the Coalition is going to increase funding, so funding is up, home care package is up and residential places are up. There are 20,000 additional high home care packages now in play, 40 million to support aged care providers in regional and rural Australia, 14,000 residential beds and short-term restorative care places to be made available, 105 million for Indigenous communities, plus 60 million for capital investment, an investment in additional viability supplement for regional areas of Australia. The greatest risk for older Australians would be a Labor government. In September last year, the Leader of the Opposition was in Townsville saying that Australians don't want or need another tax. And now he wants to tax retirees. He wants to rip into their pockets of retirees who've worked hard all their lives and take 10.6 million out of their pockets. To the people of Braddon, the 3,534, we won't do that to you. To the people of Longman, the self-funded retirees, 4,356, we will not do that to you. To the 7,643 in Mayo, we will not do that to you. Our older Australians have built this nation and we enjoy the benefits of their hard work. They deserve to keep their hard-earned money in their own pockets to spend. Unlike the opposition who ripped money out of aged care to prop up their budget bottom line, the government is making record investments in aged care. It's a record $5 billion. I also want to say that the people in Braddon, Longman and Mayo who are over 65, those services are there for you. We will make sure that we deliver on the aged care needs of people in this country. This government has a real plan for Australians, and on my recent visit to Page, with a great local member like the member for Hogan, Page, we enjoyed a visit to Widden where we saw older Australians enjoying the benefits of living with certainty,
member for Solomon,
knowing that the quality of care is better, their ageing opportunities is better and their access to aged care services is better. But the other element to that is that the Turnbull government has the best interests of older Australians in mind, and we will continue to work for them, unlike the opposition who wants to tax them, scare them and intentionally set out to deceive them. This government will continue to focus on the needs of our self-funded retirees and senior Australians who deserve better than what they get at times.
The member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister standing in the way of Labor's plan to give a labourer in Longman earning $50,000 a tax cut of $928 a year, almost double the tax cut they'll get from the government? Why does this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister want 10 million Australians, including labourers, teachers, nurses, electricians and mechanics, to pay more tax and big business to pay less tax?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, and the honourable member no doubt has paid careful attention to the reports that demonstrate that under the Labor's tax proposals that he was referring to, a public school teacher, for example, would pay between $800 and $1,200 more tax every year. A crane
Members on both sides
would pay between $900 and $1,600 more tax every year. A primary school principal would pay between $5,000 and $7,000 more tax every year. The difference between the government's personal income tax reform and what Labor has proposed is that we have a comprehensive plan for reform. A comprehensive plan. There is a $530 tax refund next year, but then the plan goes on to reach the point where 94% of all Australian taxpayers will not face a marginal rate of more than 32.5 cents in the dollar. And Labor is saying they oppose that plan. They say it's unfair. And yet one example after another can be shown. I've read out a couple of hard-working Australians on middle incomes in jobs that not middle. Well, they're one of the honourable members opposite, but one of the honourable members opposite believes that crane operators, forklift drivers and primary school principals are members of the undeserving rich that need to be soaked. Is that right? Really? The Labor Party talks about being out of touch. The Labor Party fails to recognise that those dollars are hard-earned and Australians are entitled to keep more of them. And we are delivering personal income tax reform that respects them, respects their hard work and will ensure they can keep more of the money they've earned. It's their money, not the government's. It's their money. They've earned it. They can keep more of it to advance their dreams and their aspirations and that of their families.
The member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Sorry, hang on. Sorry, I thought you were seeking to ask a question. The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister was comprehensively reading from a document. I asked him to table it.
Was the Prime Minister quoting from a confidential document? The member for Brisbane has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left.
What a time waste.
My question's to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure and Cities. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is delivering on its record $75 billion investment in transport infrastructure, and how will this infrastructure pipeline support economic growth, including in my electorate of Brisbane? Is the Minister aware of any dangers to this growth or the creation of jobs?
The Minister for Infrastructure has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Brisbane, who is delivering for his constituents. He has been instrumental in the Turnbull government making a commitment to invest $300 million in the Brisbane Metro, along with a commitment of over $600 million from the Brisbane City Council, an organisation, of course, led by the LNP, with a very capable track record of delivery. And so what the member for Brisbane is going to deliver to his constituents is a high-frequency metro network, some 21 kilometres of existing busway, links between 8 Mile Plains and Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, between the University of Queensland Lakes and Brisbane and the Brisbane CBD. And of course this will address congestion on the Victoria Bridge. It will improve travel times, improve reliability, improve convenience for Brisbane commuters. Now I'm asked by the member for Brisbane presciently if there are any dangers to the implementation of the government's $75 billion infrastructure program. And the principal danger I need to inform the Minister for Brisbane would be if this hopeless rabble on the other side of the House were ever to form government. Now, we need to be clear, their record of rank incompetence is by no means limited to transport and infrastructure. You can look at the NBN, where in 6 years, they spent $6 billion
Members on my left.
and barely 50,000 premises were able to connect to the fixed network.
The Minister will just pause for a
6
second.
years.
Minister, the member for Burt has been warned, amongst others, he will leave under 94A. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was going through a brief list of some of Labor's most comprehensive and egregious implementation stuff-ups. Of course, there's the chaos of the pink bats, and my personal favourite, the member for Adelaide's contribution, in the double drop-off. Who remembers in the double drop-off? a 2007 promise they were going to build 260 early childcare centres all across schools around the country. How many had they delivered when they finally slunk away from that program in 2010? The historical record shows it was 38. 38. So Labor cannot deliver. Their implementation is hopeless. What about the 12 rail lines that state Labor promised in New South Wales? They delivered not one of them. What about the Gawler line electrification, a comprehensive stuff-up by the Weatherill Labor government that has taken the coalition to fix up, and we're committing funding for the Gawler line electrification. Labor's track record of implementation in transport and in every other portfolio is egregious and hopeless, and that is a huge danger to the Australian people.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Health. Can the Minister assure the House that he's not been involved in any other instances of the kind we have described here in the papers, involving inappropriate language or behaviour towards stakeholders, public servants or staff?
The member for North Sydney will cease interjecting. The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I will again sincerely reiterate my apology to the Mayor of Katherine. Now, I was asked some questions before question time today by the same news agency that had their story along a similar lines. They wanted to know whether or not, in my time in Parliament, there had been any complaints by staff to the Department of Finance or Parliamentary Services. To the best of my knowledge, to the best of our records, the answer is no. I'm happy to continue to check on that, but to the best of my knowledge and the best of my records. In addition to that, I was also asked whether there were any cases of complaints from staff to my Chief of Staff or Office Manager. Again, to the best of my knowledge and to the best of my record, the answer is no. In 17 years. In addition to that, I was also asked whether there had been any mediations or settlements with staff. To the absolute clarity of everything that I know, the answer is no, and there have certainly never been such things. And I was also asked whether or not there had been any issues in relation to public servants. There is one case, because I want to be absolutely upfront. There is one case which was raised with me, a former Secretary of Health. The Prime Minister himself raised it and asked that I speak with the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I think as soon as the Prime Minister was made aware, he asked me to deal with it. This was in relation to issues around the progress of the National Cancer Screening Register for cervical cancer. There was a risk, not long after I came in, that that program would not commence and women would be left without screening, which was literally one of the few things in this place that is a life and death issue. I did, as ministers are from time to time, have a strong discussion with the Secretary, and that was raised with me by the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet after the Prime Minister asked if I would do that. He acted immediately, and again, I take full responsibility for that. But this was a matter of life and death, literally, and I think in that situation, whilst it was a strong discussion, it resulted in the right outcome. The program was able to be continued, and I have utmost respect for the public servant involved. So I say this with the best of my knowledge and in full clarity of the situation.
The member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on what the government is doing to ensure that survivors of institutional child sexual abuse are going to receive reparation through the National Redress scheme?
The Minister for Social Services.
I'd like to thank the member for his question on what is a very, very important issue. As all members know, this week the House passed legislation to establish a national redress scheme. When we passed that legislation, we did so in the knowledge that all states and territories, except for Western Australia, had opted in to the scheme, and I'm confident that Western Australia will opt in the near future. We found out yesterday also that the Catholic Church will opt into the scheme, and today the Anglican Church, the Salvation Army, the Scouts and the YMCA also said that they will be part of this national scheme. Can I say to all members in this House, you all deserve credit for putting the interests of survivors first when it comes to this issue. Can I commend the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard for over 7 years ago having established this Royal Commission. Can I commend my shadow for the personal interest that she has taken in this interest, and the way that she spoke on that bill during the week would have touched every member of this House. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his leadership on this issue and hosting survivor groups at Kirribilli, showing them the utmost dignity that they deserve. Can I thank my predecessor, the now Attorney-General, for the way he handled his issue when he was in the office that I now have the honour to hold. Mr Speaker, delivering justice for the survivors of child sexual abuse is something that all of us in this place want to see and can now make happen by 1 July. It will not deal with all the crimes, all the sins that were committed on those young, innocent people, but it will go a long way to help. It will mean that they can get payments of up to $150,000, an average payment of around $76,000, access to psychological counselling and, as importantly, an apology from those institutions, whether they were governments or non-government institutions, who committed these heinous crimes on these people.
The member for Jagga on indulgence.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Just briefly on indulgence, I'd like to associate the opposition with the remarks of the Minister and extend our thanks to him for his excellent work in getting the redress scheme to this point. It has been a very, very long time, particularly for the survivors of child sexual abuse, and the 1st of July will be a very, very significant moment for them particularly, but also for our nation.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.